Speaking of the justice system, we've already heard a lot about restorative justice, and the speaker hasn't even come up yet. So it is certainly going to be a very important part of both the court system and people's lives in the future. And you have to really not be an expert, but you really know how to do it right. And fortunately, we have someone right here who knows how to do it right. Her name is Libby Mills from Restorative Justice right here in Louisville. Change the slides.
Gotcha. Okay. I'll just stay here if I'm going to do the slides. Does this work? Gotcha. All right.
Libby Mills.
All right. Unfortunately, right after lunch, after pizza. So I'll try to keep this interactive so we can all move forward.
Turn the light down.
Oh, okay.
Number 3.
Yes.
Oh, now we even get to put you in the dark. So, as he said, my name is Libby Mills. I'm the Executive Director of Restorative Justice Louisville. Restorative Justice Louisville is a private nonprofit agency that is very, very new. We just started in 2011, and we've been steadily growing as we go through this. What I want to do today is give you an overview about what restorative justice is, because people get it confused with restoration of rights and other issues, so we want to talk about that. And I put this slide presentation together for some people in the community, and I titled it, "How is it not worth it?" And I'll tell you, we'll go through this, and we'll talk about it as we go through. This is a quote from a person who participated in a conference process, and after she had gone through the process and meeting with a young person who was the offender in her case, this is what she said. It was our time to be heard. What they did was wrong, and that they needed to improve their behavior. Now, that's very straightforward and point blank what the experience was. This is the experience, the quote of a young man who participated, not the same lady, who participated in a conference. He actually participated in a conference with a law enforcement officer. It changed my views on life. You really don't know what someone is thinking until they tell you about it or you get inside your own brain. Now, our traditional court system is retribution, which means it's based on punishment of offenders rather than rehabilitation. And it asks the questions: who committed the crime, what laws were broken, and how will we punish the offender? Now, if we ask those questions, whose voices are heard? Lawyers. Who else? Police. Who else?
Victim's family.
Victim's family? Maybe. Yeah, whoever, the person who was charged. All right, so let's look at the other definition. Restorative justice is a process that involves, to the very extent possible, all those who have a stake in the incident. And together, they identify and address the harms that were done, the needs and the obligations that come from that harm, and then how to make it right. Now, if we ask these questions, what harm was done? What needs to be done to repair the harm? Who is responsible for repairing the harm? Whose voices are heard? Everyone. Who's the primary voice?
Victim.
The victims. Restorative justice is a victim-centered response to offending behavior. When I say victim-centered, that means that the victims have the utmost and the primary decision-making in this process. They decide if we go forward. They decide where we meet, when we meet, how we meet, who talks first. Because in the criminal justice system, it's very difficult for the victims to have that kind of involvement. How many of you all had observed in court, been in court? How much did the victims have to say?
None.
Not much. And in some courts, they even keep them so far apart, they keep them in different rooms. Because there's this fear that you're going to have, the confrontation or issues with people being in the same room. So if you just look at this as an old to new paradigm, and this is kind of misleading because restorative justice is really very ancient, but it's kind of something so old that it's new now and it's coming back around. So if you look at retributive justice is a violation of laws. With restorative justice, it's a violation of people and relationships. With retributive justice, law breaking creates guilt. With restorative justice, it creates obligations. With retributive justice, justice requires the state to determine blame or guilt, and then how are we going to impose pain or punishment? With restorative justice, it involves the victims, the offenders, community members, in an effort to make things right. The central focus of restorative justice is victim needs and offender accountability for repairing the harm. Now, how does that fit? Okay? Not okay? Confusing?
May I ask a question?
Sure.
In the first one, you're going to do the justice system. The state appears a number of times. The implication of state being in there is that there's a body of law, stuff that's written, that's going to oversee, guide, whatever that system is. Over under restorative justice, I don't see anything in there that says who's going to do what. You're going to sort of come together and be chummy, talk it out, and everybody's going to walk away singing Kumbaya. And that may happen, but how do you make sure this does happen?
Well, and that's an
There's no
extremely
law.
important question, because that's what people assume when you start looking at how different this is than the traditional court system. So if you look at this and people think, oh, it's going to be touchy-feely, warm and fuzzy, and in actuality, it holds offenders more accountable. And we'll talk about how that goes along. So if I don't answer your question as we go along, let me know, okay? So simply, restorative justice is when we wrong someone, we have an obligation to acknowledge the wrong or the harm and to try to make it right. And we've talked about the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? The victims, the offenders, and the community. And what we're working toward is where in that nexus of all three of those, victims, offenders, and community, can we come together? Okay? Now, there's some traditional restorative justice practices. Victim offender conferencing, family group conferencing, restorative justice circles, or community accountability boards. They're all basically have the same underpinning philosophy. It's just a matter of how those meetings are conducted and how many people are in those meetings. Victim offender conferences usually has 2 or 3, 4 people. Family group conferences, we can have as many people as the participants wish, including law enforcement. Circles, the same thing. Community accountability boards, and we're implementing a community accountability board in the 2nd Division now. We train community members to be the voice of the community. So for situations that are appropriate, they're the people that are involved in the Restorative Justice Conference. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more in a minute. So here's a definition of a family group conferencing. Victim and offender support persons, whoever they wish to be there, parents, grandparents, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, coaches, neighbors, family members, whatever. A community accountability board, I've just talked about that. Now, what we're doing here in Jefferson County is we are targeting our work. Because when we started working and developing a partnership with the criminal justice system here, we wanted to do two things. First of all, with the youth, we wanted to be able to divert as many youth from the court process as possible. The second thing we wanted to do was target minority youth, because there's a huge disparity in how they're processed through the juvenile justice system. So we started with the second division, which is on the far, on your left, the far in the green, that's the second division. And then we added the first, which is over here in the purple on the top, not on this side, but on that side. And then we added the fourth, which is the light blue between. Those three divisions make up almost 50% of the referrals of juveniles into the juvenile justice system in Jefferson County. So that's where we started. Now, I want to talk to you about the underpinning of a restorative justice, the underpinning of the philosophy of restorative justice. And part of it, it connects to a broken window theory. How many have heard of the broken window theory? It's been around for a long time, yeah. If you do surveys in communities, they're usually going to tell you, the results of that survey is usually going to tell you, we're not concerned about, murders or serious crimes. We're concerned about our street lights aren't working, our sidewalks aren't clean, there's abandoned buildings, there's broken windows, and just the basic everyday living, the quality of our life is not good. So we know that most crimes are opportunistic and predicted by the offender's belief that nobody cares. So why should I think twice? And the lack of care of upkeep in a community is the cue to the criminal that this is okay. This behavior is okay. So if we have the people who are committing the crimes thinking that the community members don't care, do they have a second thought? Now I want to show you this little experiment real quick. There were two cars that were left out. One was in Palo Alto, a very affluent neighborhood, and one was in one of the areas of the Bronx that they classified as a ghetto. The car in the Bronx was stripped immediately. The car in Palo Alto, nobody touched it until the researchers damaged it. Once they damaged it, then the car was further damaged. So the mindset in those communities in Palo Alto, it's not okay to do this. But in the Bronx, it's okay. If it's there, it's opportunistic, it's okay for me to do it. So if we have those thinking processes, how are victims and community members viewed? One of the underpinnings of restorative justice is reintegrative shaming. And the reason I'm going to go through this is for you to understand the philosophy around this. Because normally what we do is we have stigmatic shaming. Once I identify you as a bad person, then you're out. You're outside. You don't have a way to get back into our good graces. I'm decertifying your value. So it's disapproval, humiliation, labeling. With reintegrative shaming, we're looking at a way that we apply our disapproval. We show our disapproval without humiliation and with respect. We look at ways that we can recertify or we can acknowledge these people as having worth. And not label them and give them the opportunity to reintegrate back into our society. Now, we all can talk about ways that stigmatic shaming or that stigmatic devaluation continues every day. But with restorative justice, we're looking at how do we reintegrate. We still have to hold them accountable, but how do we reintegrate them? So a restorative justice process, we start with pre-conference meetings. Now, like I said, we're starting in the juvenile justice system. We're getting ready to start a small pilot with young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds. But right now, we're working in the juvenile justice system. We get kids on the front end of the system as they enter the court system. They're referred to us from court or from the intake unit of the administrative office of the courts. The young people and their families are told up front that they have to be responsible. They have to take responsibility for what they did. We do not litigate the charges.
Trust. Yeah,
Oh,
trust.
sorry. Okay. And then once they agree to that, they're ordered to us from the court. We contact the victims or a victim representative, someone who can represent the victim voice, see if they're willing to participate because it's a voluntary program. If both parties are willing to participate, we have pre-conference meetings with both parties. With the young person who is charged and his or her family, we do not proceed without family or a guardian or some responsible adult to make sure they understand what it means to be responsible. Now, you'll be surprised, no, maybe not, about young people understanding what responsibility means and being able to say it. Because basically what they're going to need to do is say, this is what I did, this is why I did it, and this is what I'm willing to do to make amends. Now imagine a 15-year-old in a room of adults that may be as many as 5, 6, 9 adults and having to say that, with the victim being there sitting across from them. So we have to work with them to make sure that they can do that. They understand what it means and how they might be able to say that in their own words and do what they need to do. With the victims, we're talking to them about how this has impacted them. What do they know? Because a lot of times, the crime will be committed, police report will be taken, and then they don't know what happens from there. So when we're calling them and saying this is referred to us from court, this is the first time they've heard about it in a long time. So we're talking to them. What is the impact is? What's the impact it's been on you? Emotionally, financially, psychologically. What is it, and what would you like to see to make amends? For this young person to do to make amends? So if both those meetings go well, and both parties agree to continue, then we bring them all together. The victim gets to choose, gets the primary choice of when we meet, where we meet, and we meet as closest to parties as we can get to them. We meet in the community. We're in churches, we're in community centers, neighborhood places, community schools, police stations, wherever we can, they'll let us have a room. And usually the victim wants the young person to speak first. Let me know that they can take responsibility for what they did. And then they have a discussion. The first part of that conference is the story. What happened? What is your responsibility in this? ask all the questions about, why did you choose me? Did I do something that you thought it was okay to do this? Have you done this before? What are you going to do so you don't do it again? And then we talk about the impact, because it just does not impact that victim. It impacts the parents of that young person. It impacts the neighbors of that victim. It impacts the people who are around all those people. So we allow everybody to talk about how it impacted them. Then we talk about, now what do we need to do to make this right? So then they start negotiating the agreement. And it has to have 3 components, but it doesn't mean you have to have 3 items on the agreement. How do you repair the harm that was done to the victim? How do you repair the harm that was done to the community? And what does that young person need to do to reduce their risk of doing this again? Now, these are the offenses that are eligible for referral to us from juvenile court. Most of those are misdemeanor offenses except for a couple felonies. And I told you about the community accountability boards we're implementing in the 2nd Division. We're in the process of getting that started hopefully in the next month or so. We're going to be getting referrals of 18 to 25-year-olds out of district court, and these are the offenses that are going to be eligible for referral. And this is me.
Wow.
Oh, sorry, I'll go back.
That's a good idea. From now on, I'm going to put everybody's contact information on the program. Does anyone have any questions?
What percentage of your restorative justice meetings end up in a non-favorable light? Somebody, there is a conflict, somebody walks out of the room, they say, I don't think you really mean that you're not going to do this again. Does that, I work with really young kids, and one of the things that we hear people say to young kids a lot is, tell them you're sorry. So I'm trying to figure out, in that context, how you don't end up with, tell them you're sorry.
Well, first of all, that's not our primary focus. It happens naturally. When we have those pre-conference meetings, if we're driving that meeting for that young person to say, I'm sorry, how heartfelt is that? Now, I'll tell you, once we have that in the pre-conference meeting, we're making sure that that young person, first of all, understands what the charge was and understands what that they acknowledge to us they're willing to take responsibility for what they did, and then they can do that verbally. And then they're okay to be in the room with the victim or the victims and talk to them. Okay? So that's what we're working on. So what we usually do, and how I train my facilitators, is you want to ask. Have them tell you what they're going to say. If you're going to meet Ms. Moore on next Thursday and you want her to know that you're accepting responsibility for what you did, tell me what you're going to say. What can you say? And then they kind of develop that and practice it. And I'll guarantee you 90% of the time when we ask them to start, the first things out of their mouth is, I'm sorry, or I want to apologize, and then they go into, this is what I did. So, if it's your primary objective and you're pushing for that, then you're pushing for, yes, we all want them to say they're sorry, but the primary objective is being responsible. That make sense? Yes, sir.
I want to mention a couple of things. One, a comment, another is actually a question. And a study that can be done right here as a community.
in a little program, we teach our children to understand the difference between covenant and law. In a community, we have a covenant. When a teacher says that you're supposed to read, we are supposed to cooperate. And law is only when we drive too fast and we get a ticket, then we've broken the law, we know it's the law. Children understand that. That the covenant is a very important thing to live in a community. Like if my wife tells me, go and take the garbage out, I'm supposed to do that because I married her, that's some part of it I do. So they understand the simple examples. But I want to just, community is so important. I want to show you a little show by show of hands, how we are all biased. Right now, I'm going to show you. Would any of you please raise your hand if you have ever hired a guy who you knew was a criminal and got out of prison and you asked him to mow your yard? May I see a show of hands? Okay, so 4 or 5 people of the whole room. Because every one of us, to be honest with you, is scared to go out of the house if somebody's mowing the yard. So we have a built-in bias within us. One time I had mentioned that to my wife that I was going to hire someone, I thought I was going to be thrown out of the house. So the whole idea is this is a built-in bias that requires a tremendous amount of work within us. And just like Morgan Freeman said in that fancy movie, everybody's innocent in their prison. And so the whole idea is, I do not know in this restorative justice, which is of course same thing as Aristotle had said a long time ago, but it's very difficult unless we develop as a community a mindset that the guy has served his time, I guess he understands, and he's not going to be a criminal again.
And that's one of the key components. If you want to implement restorative justice practices in any, we did it with the criminal justice system. Some people would do it with schools. Some people, we're in the juvenile justice system. We're moving into the adults. Some people do it with the adults. Is you have to get in where people have that mindset, where people are there so you can kind of nurture that little impetus and then let it grow. We started with that list of offenses I showed you with about half those because that's where people were comfortable. And then it's gradually grown, and now they've asked, let's go into the adult system and try it. And so you just got to start where it is. And with the Community Accountability Board, I trained 14 community members in December. And they all knew where they wanted to be, but during the time we were doing the training, they had to go through that mindset that you're talking about. And now, they understand where they're going to be. Now, they all have different personalities. They're all coming at it from a different view, but they're willing to help these young people work through this. Yes, sir.
What type of availability, if any, does your organization have for a peer support specialist, someone who's come through the system, has committed similar crimes, and has recovered and wanting to help others achieve recovery?
With the pilot that we're doing for the young adults, a lot. Because what we're doing with them is we're starting in the 2nd Division, and particularly with Parkland, the neighborhood that's Parkland is where we're going to start. And we've developed a service continuum of 7 or 8 providers that work strictly with the adult population, so that once we get these young people in and they meet with the Community Accountability Board and they start developing those agreements, that we can get them into, do you need to be assessed for drug and alcohol issues? Do you need to be assessed to get a GED? What do you need to be able to do that? And we've got those providers on board. And so being part of that provider network would be great.
What I was looking at is more of someone who has committed that crime, done the time, went through the system, and graduated, understood their
Like a mentor?
Right.
We're looking for mentors for the young adults.
I got a question.
Yes.
It's for youth right now, just for youth, restorative justice?
Right now, but then we're getting ready, hopefully in the next month or so, to start the pilot with the 18 to 25-year-olds.
And did you say most apologize? The offender? Really? That's interesting. No last question. Evidence shows that this is working for repeat offenders, but I always wonder about the victim. Is it sometimes too much for the victim to relive it and to go through it? What has been your experience?
No, because that pre-conference meeting allows them to kind of work through some of that and process some of that. And so we don't schedule that last meeting until we know that everybody's ready to meet. And the research shows that 80 to 90% of participants, including victims, are satisfied and like going through the restorative justice process. And it reduces recidivism rates from anywhere from 30% to 70%. And even in New Zealand, it was 90%. And it's more cost effective. We did a cost analysis here in Jefferson County, and if we were basically minimally staffed, which we're not, I'm the only staff person, but if we had me, a case manager, and administrative assistant, it would cost us, and we paid our facilitators, which we don't, they're volunteers. I have 40 volunteers who help me do this. It would cost us less than $1,000 to process a case from beginning to end. Going through, and that's including first contact with law enforcement all the way through to our case being closed. If a youth is ordered for supervision out of the court system, it's a minimum of $3,000. If they go into placement for 6 months, it's about $45,000. So if we can divert kids, then it's much more cost effective. So did I answer your question? About?
Yeah, let's give her a hand.
Right.
That's what I call win-win. It's good for the victim, and we know it stops recidivism. Wow. Please.
I have a question.
Don't go anywhere.
Now, the restorative justice system is basically you're holding the youth accountable. Is that what you're basically doing, holding the youth accountable for their crime,
For their behavior.
their behavior? Now, after they go through the program, what happens to the records? Are the records cleared, or what happens after the program?
We have an agreement with the juvenile court that if a youth successfully participates with our program, that charge is dismissed and expunged. We have the same agreement for the 18 to 25-year-olds, that if they successfully complete whatever is negotiated on that written agreement at the end of the conference, if they successfully complete it, that charge will be dismissed and expunged.
Now, is that on a time period? How long of a time period are we talking that they have to go through this program?
It depends. Each case has its own story, so it has its own timeline. We've had some conferences where it's been kids fighting or issues at school, and at the end of the conference, the victim was another youth. All he wanted was a handshake and an apology. We've had others where they're paying, I've got one case now where they're paying about a little less than $1,000 in restitution in doing community service. So each case has its own story and its own timeline.
We could do a whole day just restorative justice, because it was mentioned 3-4 times even before she got up. Thank you so much for coming, Ms. Mills. We're going to take 1 second. Our organization, great job. We're going to take just 60 seconds. Our organization has received letters from our Honorable U.S. Senator McConnell and from our Honorable Secretary of State, Allison Grimes. And I'd just like to read those letters to you now, if you don't mind. Monty, you want to read Senator McConnell's letter?
Dear Mr. Wayne, I write to thank you for sharing with me your efforts to reduce acts of violence among our Commonwealth's youth. As the father of 3 daughters, I applaud your desire to challenge our youth to keep our Commonwealth and nation free from acts of violence. Ensuring that our most vulnerable have a positive supportive structure is vital to their future development as contributing members of society. Also, with our state losing more than 82 fellow Kentuckians a month to drug-related death, the potential harm that far too accessible illegal drugs pose to youth of our Commonwealth is particularly concerning. Thank you again for sharing your initiative with me and for your advocacy on behalf of Kentucky's youth. Sincerely, Mitch McConnell.
So now we have one from our Honorable Secretary of State, Allison Grimes.
Dear Mr. Wayne, thank you for your continued efforts to reduce violence among youth in your community and across Kentucky. As Kentucky's 76th Secretary of State, I have been and continue to be committed advocate for victims of violence, and I am proud to support your organization's effort on this. Wait a second, my bad. I am proud to support your organization's efforts on this important issue. Your dedication is not unnoticed, and it is an inspiration to many. I send my best regards to you and all of the attendants of the Youth Alert Louisville Forum on February 15th. Sincerely, Allison Grimes.
One of the things our Youth Alert's been saying is that there is already enough information out there to stop violence on 1,000 planets. There is already the desire, even among our elected officials. We just need to have some more team vehicles that allow everybody to participate equally.